Hello. Welcome, everyone. And if you're coming in, come join us, grab a seat. We have a really fast-paced 40 minutes for you, so we are going to run like the races. Sitting beside me, Jeanne Kitchens. Hello, Jeanne. Dr. Timothy Summers. Kacey. Hey, Kacey. Kacey Thorne, Danny King, Matt Pittinsky. I'm not going to do introductions. I'm just going to lead off with a question and ask each of you to respond to that question. And if you would, at the very beginning, tell us a little bit about what brought you here. So the one that I'll throw out. Our title is Blockchain Driving a Revolution in Credential Liquidity. So let's start at the very end, kind of back up from there. What is credential liquidity? What does that even mean? I'll let you guys take it. Jump in.
Okay, so hello everyone. First of all, you have to know that I'm not going to come directly from a perspective of blockchain.
Oh, Jeannie, can we ask who you are first? I think you should introduce yourself.
I'm actually with a group, a nonprofit called Credential Engine, and we're going to see credential liquidity about the metadata that describes that credential and unpacking all of the important information about it. So the person really knows the value of it, employers know the value of it, other training and credentialing organizations own the value of it, but of course we have to have a way to transport it. And we want the individual who has earned that credential to be able to have a little control over that information as well. So for me, the credential liquidity is not only the transportability of it in the sense that I can take my credential with me, but to have the data behind it so people really can unpack it and know what that means, and it is more liquid that way in the marketplace.
Well, that was absolutely a great way to get it started, Jeanne. Thank you. So I'm at ASU, and I'm the Executive Director of Product Development for Digital Trust, and we're building a tool called Pocket. And the perspective that we're really thinking about credential liquidity is really from the learner's perspective, being very mindful of what credentials mean from a learner's perspective. It's really fascinating when you look at various aspects of credential dependent on the field that you're in. It can have a very different meaning. If you're in medicine, for example, credentialing has a very strong meaning as opposed to if you're in information security. But when we're thinking about it from the Pocket perspective, we're thinking about the learner's ability to take their credentials with them and what that means for them, empowering them in the way that they can have the ownership and really the control and the ability to manage those credentials in a way that's most viable for them, but also most advantageous for them, and in terms of how they can then develop pathways of the future to the jobs of the future, some of which that don't even exist yet, right? And so that's really where we're thinking about credential liquidity from the Pocket perspective. I really think we're going to end up in a really unique place where we're going to start to ask the questions around the value of those credentials. And that liquidity piece really makes a lot of sense there.
Great. Kacey.
Yeah, so I'm Kacey Thorne, Director of Skills Architecture with WGU. And when I think of liquidity, I think about the properties of a liquid and specifically how it is and can be transparent, but also there's a fluidity to it. And what I mean by that, at WGU, the work that we're doing around digital credentialing, we are really invested in making sure that they are much more transparent in terms of the workforce relevant skills that those credentials represent. And that has been a big focus over our work over the last 2 years. And then also fluidity in terms of being able to take those credentials and port them across systems, across contexts, as a means for career mobility for an individual. So that's how I would define liquidity.
Hi everyone, I'm Danny King. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Accredible. So we make it really easy to issue digital credentials. So we have about 1,400 customers, and I think every single one of our customers would have a different definition of credential liquidity. So I think I'll try and summarize the average definition. I think for me it was about more two credential holders that might have the exact same credential might want to have a very different narrative to an employer or to an education provider or something like that. So the ability to sort of mold your own narrative around a credential rather than it being a sort of one-size-fits-all That is emerging as a thesis, I think, for us.
So, and I'm Matt Pittinsky, CEO at Parchment. And so when we think about credentials, it's transcripts, certificates, diplomas, digital badges, these summative documents that say what we know and how well we know it. If I think about a transcript, an illiquid transcript would be an envelope in an envelope inside another envelope, where if you break the seal and oxygen touches the paper, then it's considered invalid, and it's sitting in a manila envelope in your parents' house. And that is how we think about transcripts today. That was an attempt at doing transcript humor, which is a genre that you might imagine is very challenging. A liquid transcript is one where you've got data and all of a sudden you know where your credits are going to be accepted and you can transfer more efficiently. A liquid transcript is when you're placed into first-year courses based in part on your prior academic achievement in the subject, or where someone understands that you may have been a sociology major, but you actually know R and Stata, and that kind of prepares you to be an effective data scientist. So it's sort of the Forrest Gump principle that a credential is as a credential does, and I think a liquid credential just allows you to do more with the information inside that credential.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I'm Donna Kidwell. I'm the Chief Information Security and Digital Trust Officer at ASU. I'm not going to define this for you today because those are fantastic definitions, but I do think that my role here today is to make sure we've got liquidity in the conversation. So that's really where I'll be at. You know, as we were, frankly, I think we could have spent the better part of a day prepping for this because we had a lot of fun in all of our prep conversations leading into this. And as you guys were speaking, I think maybe let's start with the word narrative. You mentioned that, Danny. I could hear a lot of that reflected. I know the kind of work that both of you are doing. And what is it that, and we're kind of going to lead into the blockchain now, what is it about the blockchain that supports a narrative?
Do you want to take this one?
I mean, it kind of goes to the core thing, like why blockchain? What's the...
Okay, so perhaps I'm the wrong person to start because I'm not sure the blockchain helps or doesn't help at all with this. I think that the blockchain makes it easy to have an indisputable record of something's validity. I think it also makes it easier to decentralize something. I think that the blockchain is not specifically designed to help with something like that per se. Timothy, I do wonder if you disagree.
So, I think that the first thing is it depends on so blockchain being just one type of distributed ledger technology. I think it depends on the case and the use case. What exactly is it that you're trying to do? We were having some conversation about this a little earlier, and one of the places where the blockchain, and frankly, I think the blockchain really kind of should play more of a background role because it's emerging as this data structure that we're seeing specific use cases and places where we can utilize it, but it's not a panacea, right? You can't plug a blockchain in everywhere. However, in this particular case, when it comes to narrative, one of the things that is really interesting is the idea of a learner having their own ledger. And so are you talking about a ledger of and that really is dependent, right? So are we talking about a ledger between institutions, or are we talking about a person having their own ledger that they're storing things on? I think if you're talking about a learner having their own ledger upon which they're storing things, therein is where a narrative can be really built and where you might have a really strong learner journey that can really craft an important story.
Yeah, and with that said, though, can't that blockchain, could it not utilize another data source? So if you have the metadata that is providing the narrative and telling, giving that information that becomes valuable for that liquidity, for the transfer, whether or not it's going to an employer or some other learning opportunity where you want to know that you don't have to take all these courses or do all these things, you've already done it, you have the skills. So we can combine the strengths of it doesn't have to be one thing that takes care of the problem.
Right, and I feel like you can do most of that without any sort of blockchain. The blockchain can sort of make it easier to transport and sort of, but it feels more like an infrastructural layer that the blockchain won't solve this problem. The blockchain will help us once we solve the problem.
It has me thinking a little bit about like different narratives and different stories, though, too. Like you could have, the big fish tales where you're not really sure if the story that you're getting is true or not. How much can I trust it? And so I think that blockchain can play a pretty important role in terms of verified and trusted credentials that we're putting in. And then I think there's a play here as well in terms of the narrative from like a learning and employment record perspective, where you're getting the narratives of someone who is picking up skills, credentials, achievements across a lifetime of work and learning, and the story that it's telling about that person as a whole can be really powerful. But then also, what's the narrative that I want to craft for the audience that I am speaking to, and what pieces do I want to pull out of this to tell that specific story?
You know, Kacey, you just opened a really interesting door. When we did some of our initial focus groups, for example, with users around Pocket, one of the most interesting things was I remember a particular quote. Someone said, "Putting my credentials into this kind of system enables me to feel like I own the masters of my music." And I thought that was really powerful. Just adding into that, to your point.
I love that.
I would love it if, I feel that the blockchain is this thing in the background that should just make things work, and it's about trust.
Yeah.
I agree.
And I would love it if we, in 5 years or 10 years, we think about the blockchain, when I'm talking about blockchain, I mean in order to verify credentials in this particular use case, like we think about SSL on the internet today, right? So you know that little lock in your web browser when you log into your Gmail or your bank account? You just sort of glance up and you sort of check that it's there, and then you'll feel reassured that the transaction's secure and no one's spying on you. And I think that essentially blockchain will help us get to a glanceable sort of like, oh, okay, I trust it. But it's not the solution to the pedagogical side of things.
Well, and this is a problem that some of us have been working on for a while. I think, Matt, you first talked about learner records a little while ago. Like, you've been on this journey for a while.
That is true. So I had the privilege of editing a book in 2001 or 2002. And the last chapter was predictions about change in education technology. Before Parchment, I co-founded Blackboard, the e-learning company. And it's always dangerous to do predictions, and the timescale of change in education is 20 years, not 5 years. So thank you for not asking how things will be in 5-year question.
Tried to be kind of graceful there.
Because there'll be a lot like today. But in that, talked about the notion of a learner profile, that over our life course, we're going to collect and manage credentials issued by many different kinds of organizations. And here we are, 20 years later, or however many years later. I do think blockchain, if it's not blockchain as a technology, what's been incredibly constructive about blockchain is it's really accelerated in the conversation notion like the learner owns their credentials, notions like the learner should be able to collect and manage their credentials across their life course. But that's still very contested ground for institutions who view credentials as their data. They're the issuing authority. It's their administrative records. And so there's still a lot to be sorted.
Well, and again, I'm just going to keep on. It's like we have these credentials. What do they mean? And we know in the US alone, there's about 1 million unique credentials. I mean, isn't that crazy? If you think about the digital badges, the micro credentials, degrees of all types, and every one of them are different. They are not the same. Diplomas, occupational licenses, there are so many of them. And even if we have just that ability to transport it, what does it mean? What is behind it? What were the actual, beyond a transcript, right? We're all familiar with what a transcript looks like. It's very limiting information in terms of understanding, you got a grade in something, or you passed something or did not pass something, so what is the data behind it that gives it that liquidity so it can make it so much easier to maybe instantly get a job, right? And not have to go through the processes that, people go through now. So I think it comes with both sides of the story. It's how do we allow that flexibility of moving this data around, and then how do we connect it up so we actually have rich information that really helps that person.
Yeah, and then bringing it back to the narrative point, this one size fits all credential thing. I'd like to live in a world where we don't summarize people down into a letter or a GPA, and that's it. That's 4 years of education for you. I'd like to live in a world where that's a glanceable thing that, can allow you to sort of quickly sort people into buckets if you really need to, but then allow individuals to be able to say, okay, yeah, I was a B in math or a D in math or whatever, but this is the area that I was really, really interested in, and that's why I think you should focus on this part, and that part perhaps isn't super relevant. So, I think we need a higher resolution image of who people are than just a letter.
And to that point, I mean, that's really powerful, and I like that you said higher resolution, because one of the things that's really exciting is, you know, being able to, and it's another quote from a learner, being able to represent my whole self. And that's really interesting when you think about how you're able to represent, you know, your abilities, your ideas, your concepts, your curiosities, the things that you're interested in. And then you being able to reflect on those things yourself and having credentials that are representative of that is so powerful. But when I think about the flexibility, you said the word flexibility, and I love this because I think about, you know, for example, one of our designers, originally from South America, but teaching in Canada, and talked about how she had to fly back to Peru twice just to get the documentation and everything shared, right, with the right places and the right folks. And we think about the amount of value that, you know, it was for her to have that credential brought to her current place. Think about it even further for learners of tomorrow. What is this going to mean? We're in a place right now, I think that credentials, digital credentials specifically, and this idea of credential liquidity is encouraging us to reflect on what the value of our training and education and knowledge means.
Yes.
And we're all sitting at that intersection, and I think that's really worth noting.
I really love the description that you use when you said resolution, because blockchain is and can be a really powerful technology tool in this space, specifically when we're talking about, you know, learners across a lifetime of work and learning. What it doesn't solve for is the transparency into those different experiences, those different achievements. It is only as good as the information that we feed it, the information that we're putting into it. And so I think there's, you know, something I am extremely passionate about is how can we make for better resolution of credentials in terms of the skills that someone has, so that we are less reliant on the credentials that they hold as a proxy for the skills that those credentials represent.
You know, I want to ask you guys, because and Matt, I'm thinking about some of the things that I know you've seen on your journey. You know, one of these things is getting greater transparency. Another piece is potentially persistence. I mean, what happens to that same individual if the institution that they need to go back home to, and they're taking that international flight, if that institution's no longer there?
It's absolutely, and I think we're building this story of liquidity as we're going through the discussion, right? We're capturing different elements of it. So user control, machine-readable data, the ability to collect and manage across multiple credential issuers. Another one of it is the durability or the permanence of the record. So one of the things that Parchment does is we act as a repository when schools close. So when institutions close, they can move their records to us, and we think it's a wonderful service that students can continue to access those records even though the institution is gone. And we did that, for example, for the ITT system. But it's also among the most heart-wrenching kind of support conversations to have when someone calls up and maybe, you know, their gender identity has changed and they want their records to reflect that, and we say, we're sorry, you know, your record is at the moment that we got it and we can't change it because, you know, for a whole bunch of reasons we can't go down that road. Or there were a group of nursing students who, I don't remember the exact story, but basically their final transcripts as moved over to us didn't reflect either an assessment that they completed or a course that they completed, which meant they couldn't sit for the nursing exam and they had to redo an entire year over again. And that's just heartbreaking. I mean, for us, we have to deal with the record exactly as we received it at the time, in this case, that ITT closed. But you just, you know, that issue of permanence, and that's in a US context where we have a very stable educational system and generally stable populations. You know, now you move into environments where it's unstable, you know, you have migrant populations and so on, that ability to have permanence to records. Again, blockchain isn't the only way to solve for that, but it has become an index or a proxy for that idea and helping people understand why that's an important thing for a credentialing system to solve for, whether it's through blockchain or otherwise.
And the problem's a lot bigger than I think people realize. I've forgotten the numbers. Do you know how many universities go bust each year? Do you have?
I should. No, I don't. I actually don't know. I mean, in the U.S., I'm going to guess it's somewhere in the 50 to 75. So it's not as, and they tend to be very, very small, proprietary schools.
Right.
But yes, it is bigger than we think.
Yeah, you think it's one or two every
you add
decade or something, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, we have a portfolio of maybe 50 institutions that are former.
But this is one of the things. Sorry, that was loud. This is one of the things that blockchain can solve, and it is designed for. The idea being that if you put your credentials on something like the blockchain, or I suppose Parchment's an alternative as well, and there's no reason they can't be the same thing too. But you don't need to have a central authority like the university to say, oh yes, Danny King did graduate in 2008. You can verify it independently of an Accredible or a university. There's great power in that.
And I mean, this just came up in transcripts with students who couldn't transfer. The great Ithaca study around the degree to which students are not able to transfer because of a fee. It could be a $5, $10 fee that's sitting in the issuing institution's system, and they can't get access to their transcripts. So they have all these credits that they want to be able to apply, and yet they're blocked. So this is still, though, very contested ground in terms of how institutions think about credentials as administrative data that they have a right to control and manage, and learners think about it as their records, and owning the master of their music, which I think is an awesome way of phrasing it.
And we're
the music studios don't like the artists to get the master, right. And it's not dissimilar in education.
Right, and we're really. I think that there's a lot of room here, for us to think about. So we've been looking at self-sovereign identity, right? Thinking about this idea of the learner owning that data. What does that mean? And that's why when we started talking about the blockchain, I said it really depends on where we're talking about the ledger, because a lot of times when people hear the word blockchain, they automatically assume that we're talking about a blockchain that we're all sharing. But as Danny's already said here, for example, it's not always the case that's what's going on. It may be that you're utilizing this ledger for a different reason. I'm curious, actually, I want to ask you a question, Danny. I'm curious about, because you guys actually are taking a really fascinating approach to blockchain, right? And maybe, I don't know if, maybe you could share a little bit about what you guys are doing there, because I think it's interesting.
Sure. And this is just one way to do things. So, Accredible, as some of you may know, we help you to issue digital credentials, but they can take many formats. It might be a digital badge, or it might be a digital certificate. One of the formats we can issue is a blockchain credential. So what's the difference, say, between a blockchain credential and one that isn't? Well, in our platform, we really focused super duper hard on you don't have to know what blockchain is to use this. I think that was our stance. And so we really put blockchain to kind of behind the scenes, just like that little lock in your browser. There are other implementations of blockchain credentials that are very, very different to that, which you might need to have a blockchain wallet, in order to sort of receive it or verify it. We thought that was too complicated. So for us, the way that we do it is simply, our blockchain credentials look and feel identical to our non-blockchain credentials, except when you click on verify, there's a little sort of blockchain icon, but essentially it's doing an extra check. It's not just checking against our servers and our customer servers to see if the credential is what it says it is. It's also now checking against an encrypted version of that credential on the blockchain. So it's encrypted, so you can't see the data on the blockchain. You can't go and read that, but what you can do is see if it changed. Just like when you log into a bank, it checks if your password is the same password that it thinks it knows of. Now, the bank doesn't know your password, it knows an encrypted version. So we have this very minimal, simple, behind the scenes, and it's not about being a distributed ledger, which is something you're working on. Instead, it's simply, was this tampered with? I could see another world where we'd launch another blockchain credentialing product, which was more about a distributed ledger, perhaps, but that's how we're sort of looking at this today. And the final thing I'll say is, if it isn't simple, people won't use it. The analogy I sometimes give is about encrypting email. So there's this thing called PGP, pretty good encryption. We've had it since, the 80s. Is that correct, Timothy?
It's been around for a while.
And it allows you to encrypt emails from me to you or whatever. And actually, most of the emails that we send are laughably insecure. I could I'm sure Timothy could be better at this. He has a background in cybersecurity. Could make an email. I could email you, Donna, and make you think that Timothy sent it, and it's sort of trivially easy to do. Now, companies like Google have made it much harder recently, but we've had a solution to this since the 80s, but it's really complicated. You need to have a public key and a private key, and you need to understand how it works, and so no one does it. So it's all good and well having a really robust blockchain solution, but if it's not simple and elegant, I don't think it will be used.
I definitely agree with that. One of the reasons that I thought it was really fascinating is that organizations are starting to learn the different ways that they can utilize the blockchain, right? And this is a case in point. And in our perspective, for example, with what we're doing with Pocket, right now we're focusing just on what the ledger looks like for the user. We're just making it really easy, and agree with you that, frankly, I don't want learners walking around talking about blockchains. I just don't think that makes a whole lot of sense in the grand scheme of what we're talking about here. And definitely the product has to be something not only that's easy to use, but it's got to be something that people want to use, right? Because we're talking about storing part of our journey in this thing.
And understand the value of it, because when you were talking about like the story of a person who needed some information to get an occupational license or whatever, they probably had no clue of the significance of that one little piece of information that was absent. So the other thing is we could have all the mechanisms for moving this information between us to make it more viable for the person who owns that credential. But they also have to understand the value of it and what is inside of it and why it matters, because you could have that and still end up in that situation that you were describing where, but you can't do something and your institution is closed. So how do we address that as well? How do we get people to understand that? Because I almost feel like people are getting cheated right now, because they're not using this and they're not getting all the benefits that we know that they can have.
Value, that word value, right? I mean, that's something that I think is one of the most important points of this credential conversation. And we're all looking at this from the perspective of how do we leverage this blockchain stuff and how do we build and extend these credentials? One of the things that I'm also wondering about is how do we create a way so that we're able to learn from each other once we have these credentials, right? And share that knowledge.
I want to kind of build on, and we'll weave together a little bit, the richness of that narrative. And some of these, we're being a little bit not precise about what data we're talking about, but it is really complex. And I think across all of you, you're focusing on different parts of the challenge and different parts of the data. Kacey, your work in skills is a good example. So I'm curious if you could kind of share what is it about skills that makes it an entry point for the work you're doing?
Yeah. So skills do a couple of things, and we had some early learnings around the importance of skills in some of the pilots that Western Governors University was involved in through the White House around LER. And what we were learning as we were participating in these pilots, that it's really great to have an LER to be able to use open data standards so that credentials between different platforms can be shared and that there's interoperability between them. But the power in that is not fully tapped into until we understand what the skills are that underlie those credentials, because it's just creating a digital version of a problem that we have now as employers are saying, we don't trust the college degree. I don't know what this credential represents, and it's time for us to start getting clearer about that. So skills, specifically what we've developed as part of the Open Skills Network and Western Governors University, the Rich Skills Descriptor is a little data package. It's a schema of information that you can embed into a digital credential to provide more transparency that way, and it can be linked to job codes. It has a very clear description of what the skill looks like performed for particular job roles, and you can link it to dynamic market data so that anywhere that you've embedded that rich skills descriptor into a digital credential, then the earner of that credential can see the demand for the skills within that credential in their region across the nation, what job roles might be open that are requiring that skill. So there's some real power within that little data set. That's an extremely important piece, I think.
So Jeanne, a lot of your work too is really trying to help facilitate that total ecosystem.
Yes, as a matter of fact, we're working very closely with the Open Skills Network, and I facilitate or help facilitate the technical group because we're very vested in the idea, because what Kacey's describing is, again, it's metadata. We have to have this as data, and yes, it needs to be interoperable, but we also need it discoverable. So if you want to be discovered, I mean, of course, we know about LinkedIn and other tools that are out there that people are using every day, but it's still limiting in terms of describing what they can actually know or able to do, their capabilities, all those kinds of things that have to be unpacked a bit more, and the RSDs support that. And at Credential Engine, our credential transparency description language aligns with all of that work. So it's really important, for that liquidity. You have to know, well, what is it that this person knows and is able to do, and other important attributes as well, because we're all humans and we don't want to leave that out either.
And I think it's getting more and more important because we were talking here about, well, I don't understand what this university degree means, but that's one thing. Now we've got Google issuing credentials, and we've got all sorts of organizations that are now entering into. One of the things I said in my presentation earlier was, you don't hire a computer scientist anymore. You hire an Amazon Web Services backend engineer or a Google Cloud certified engineer. You don't hire a nurse anymore. You hire a cardiac nurse. So the degree now is actually often a foundation for the beginning of some specialized career. And so, oh gosh, how it was hard enough keeping track of all the different university degrees. Now we have to keep track of all these different specializations, and those move at the speed of the market. Right, it takes a few years to create a new degree. I think for 4 or 5 years we didn't have any data science degrees, but it was still one of the highest paid jobs in Silicon Valley. And it's companies like Google now that are sort of training the data scientists, as well as the universities. So we need a way for an employer to look at a credential and get context on what does this mean, what can they do, and that ideally, in my opinion, should be on the credential itself in the metadata. And an organization like Credential Engine, trying to standardize and be able to communicate that well is super duper important.
And how did they demonstrate it?
Please.
Sorry, and how did they demonstrate it? What was the evidence?
Right.
What was that assessment event? How do we know that we've actually validated the skills that credential represents? And that's another piece of really important embedded metadata. Yeah.
Yeah, and in many ways, the technology is the least important part of it, and the most trivial part of it is it's the program work, the assessment work, the skills taxonomy. But that's another sense of liquidity. If we think about literal currency liquidity, part of that is sort of interchange across. How does a pound relate to the U.S. dollar, relate to other currencies in this world where within any particular field there are multiple credentials, that people can earn from lots of different providers. How do we make sense of them in relation to each other? And the only way we can imagine doing that is through skills and competencies. It's the only lingua franca that I can imagine where you could ultimately get this down to an atomic unit that's actually mappable. Now that, again, is a lot easier said than done. We tend to talk about competencies as if they're this sort of real thing. What does it mean to write well, speak well, think analytically, be comfortable with numbers? What does it mean to do it in a small company, a big company? What does it mean to do it in finance versus manufacturing? These things are more multidimensional and complex than I think sometimes we appreciate. But that's another notion of liquidity. If we can get credentials down to the level of skill or competency, context will still matter a ton, but we can begin to make sense of these things in relation to each other, given there are so many different providers now that are credentialing.
I think that we speak a lot about the value to the institution, right, and our ability to see the skills someone has, to verify the skills that someone has. I also think it's important to think about it from the exact opposite way too. I actually care what skills I have. I want to know what skills I have too. I want to inventory those as well, right? My interests and things that I like to do. And it's really fascinating to think about that, because when you start to actually get down to the individual level, we all have loads of these credentials that we're interested in or ways to represent skills. One of the things that we've been prototyping with at ASU is the idea of being able to do verifiable credentials, skills and competencies as verifiable credentials, and what that could potentially look like. And we think that there's a lot of value there, not only on the institution side, but also on the side of the individual as well, the learner.
We've only got about 6 minutes left, and I want to think back to some of how you began, which are control. And we've talked a little bit about learners having some agency, some ownership. I don't think we've used the word agency yet. But I'd really like your thoughts on the opportunity here to really work this technology and these kinds of ideas that we have towards better diversity and inclusion. think back to this time last year, my son's applying to go to ASU. His high school was kind of shut down because of COVID, so he couldn't get a transcript. And incredibly, privileged, but also tortured because I'm his mom. He had a mechanism by which I could chase down and get that transcript. But that's a position of privilege. So I'm very curious about your thoughts of how this work might actually meaningfully, demonstrably help that issue.
Well, I mean, my first thought is it makes it harder. I mean, you can't, certainly now in this environment, you can't look past the unintended negative consequences of technology and of data aggregation. So there's always this irony that on the one hand, if we think about retention, for example, students who are first generation, we talk how much about scaffolding their experience through college is key for them to complete. But then on this other side, we imagine that if technology just puts the individual in control of everything and gives them infinite choices, that somehow that's going to advance equity. And so those two don't resolve to each other. So I actually, I think the equities are in favor of students from less privileged backgrounds being more at risk and more lost in a world where credentials and credentialing is even more fragmented, where there are many more pathways, and where the expectations of institutions is you're going to self-direct and self-curate, which isn't to say that individuals don't have agency and can't make intelligent decisions for themselves. It's just to recognize the complexity that we're asking people to make sense of when we throw them into this world where to progress, you could get the credential from the hospital, you could get it from the community college, you could do a degree. Like these are complicated, high-stakes choices that I think are as likely to create a world of tracking, to use a high school analogy, as it is to where people go down a vocational track versus a degree track versus whatever, as it is to empower individuals into some sort of utopia. Sorry.
So I just want to build on that just a little bit, because you can have a powerful tech solution like blockchain or any of the other kinds of applications that you can build on top of it to provide transparency to opportunity, but transparency does not equal access. And there are still social mechanisms that need to be addressed. And I think, some of the conversation in the LER space is bringing that to light. Just because someone can port a credential from institution to institution or can speak about their skills doesn't mean that we've removed the barrier of transportation. We haven't removed the barrier of internet access. We haven't removed, food insecurity from the equation. And so I think that's a conversation that is getting more focus, which is great.
If we can increase the resolution of credentials, one of the biggest reasons why we have inequality in the credentialing world is because we're forced to summarize people down into a very low resolution. And because our society is sort of built unequally, that means that, that just exacerbates that problem. So there is potential here for, we could do something good here. The flip side of that is, if we start writing algorithms that then recommend people based on the data, I think we've seen lots of examples of how algorithms can be accidentally racist or accidentally biased against women or whatever. And it's usually not intended, but it doesn't matter. The outcome is what's important. So the solution to that, in my opinion, is don't have companies like Accredible write the algorithm that is suggesting, you should take this credential next, or you should hire this person. Instead, can't a company like LinkedIn or Accredible or others make the data open to anyone to write an algorithm on, and then algorithms can start competing for the best recommendation engines, right? Make it more open source. That way, there will be biased algorithms, definitely. We know that. But then we can sort of have, an emergence of the better algorithms over time.
Organizations, I feel, institutionally, we have many constraints for when you have the conversation around diversity and inclusion. And this is one of the reasons why we think it's advantageous to look at it from the individual's perspective as well, because then I'm reminded of the poem Invictus of being the master of your own destiny. And by putting these abilities into the learner's hands, we are thereby enabling them to be the masters of their own destiny. And I think that's really something that is incredibly enheartening for me, or very exciting for me.
Yes, and I think in the end, we can come up with all the solutions, the technical solutions for all of this, and we have to remember it all has to be human-centered. It all has to be about that person and helping people achieve the things that they should have every right to have access to. So.
I'm going to close us out. Thanks so much to this incredible panel. I really wish we had had more time. Some of us are going to head to another panel on blockchain, so we're welcome to continue the conversation. If you have questions, you can do it as we walk to the other room. This afternoon, we may see you in a few hours. The JFF Foundation's having a reception, so reach out if you're interested, please, in any of the kinds of topics that we've talked to, the projects at ASU, Pocket, or the Digital Trust Network, Credential Engine's work. Really, we welcome and invite you guys to be part of this conversation. Thanks.